Robert Miller found a desperate pregnant woman pounding on his door during a violent storm. As he helped her inside, the silver locket around her neck caught his eye, and Robert suddenly couldn't breathe. It was identical to the one his late wife was buried in. But that was impossible, wasn't it? The storm had rolled in faster than anyone expected. Weather reports had talked about scattered showers, but this was nature unleashing its full fury. Rain hammered the tin roof of Robert Miller's farmhouse, and the wind howled through the cornfields like a wounded animal. Robert had just set his plate on the kitchen table. Nothing fancy, just reheated stew and some day-old bread. At 62, he'd gotten used to cooking for one since Margaret passed 3 years ago. The farmhouse, that once rang with laughter, had grown quiet, with only the occasional creak of settling wood to break the silence. He was about to take his first bite when he heard it, frantic knocking at his front door. Who could possibly be out in this weather? His nearest neighbor was 5 miles down the road. The knocking came again, more desperate this time. Robert pushed back from the table with a sigh. The old floorboards creaked under his weight as he made his way to the door, grabbing the flashlight he kept on the entryway table. When he swung the door open, the beam illuminated a sight that stopped him cold. A young woman stood on his porch, completely drenched. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and her clothes clung to her shivering body. But what really caught his attention was her swollen belly. She had to be at least 8 months pregnant. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "My car broke down half a mile back. I didn't know where else to go." For a moment, Robert just stared. It had been years since he'd had a visitor, let alone a pregnant woman appearing like a ghost from the storm. "Come in," he finally said, stepping aside. "You'll catch your death out there." The woman stumbled over the threshold, water pooling beneath her feet on his worn welcome mat. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "I'm Hannah," she managed between chattering teeth. "Hannah Collins. I'm so sorry to barge in like this." "Robert Miller," he replied. "Let's get you dry first. Explanations can wait." He led her to the living room where a small fire still burned in the hearth. The room hadn't changed much since Margaret died. The same faded floral couch, the same handmade Afghan thrown over the rocking chair, the same family photos lining the mantel. "Wait here," Robert said. "I'll find you something dry to wear." He returned minutes later with an old flannel shirt and a pair of sweatpants that had a drawstring waist. "These were my wife's," he explained a bit gruffly. "Should fit over." He gestured vaguely toward her belly. "Thank you," Hannah said, taking the clothes with trembling hands. "Is there somewhere I can change?" Robert directed her to the downstairs bathroom, then returned to the kitchen to pour a cup of hot tea. When Hannah emerged, the clothes hung loose on her frame everywhere except her middle, but at least they were dry. "The storm's only getting worse," Robert said, handing her the steaming mug. "Phones are probably out by now, too." Hannah nodded, wrapping her fingers around the warm cup. "I was trying to reach my aunt's house in Millerville. The GPS took me down this road, and then my car just died. Started smoking from under the hood." She looked up at him, her eyes welling with tears. "I didn't think anyone would be out here." "Been here all my life," Robert said. "This farm's been in the Miller family for 4 generations. Hannah took a sip of tea, then suddenly winced, one hand going to her belly. Robert felt a flash of alarm. "Are you all right?" "Just a contraction," she said, trying to smile. "I've been having them on and off all day. Still pretty far apart." Robert ran a hand through his thinning hair. A pregnant woman, a storm, contractions. This was not how he'd expected his evening to go. "How far along are you?" he asked, though he could guess the answer by looking at her. 9 months, Hannah confirmed. "Due any day now, actually." The wind chose that moment to howl particularly fiercely, rattling the windows in their frames. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. "Well, that's just perfect," Robert muttered. In the sudden darkness, the fire cast long shadows across the room. "Don't worry, I've got candles in the fireplace. We'll be fine." But as he moved to light the candles he kept in the drawer for just such occasions, he couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. There was something familiar about Hannah, something he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just that she reminded him of Margaret when she was young. What Robert didn't know was that by morning, his quiet life would be upended in ways he never could have imagined, and the storm outside would be nothing compared to the one brewing inside. With the candles lit, Robert could see Hannah more clearly now. Her dark hair fell past her shoulders, and her eyes, a deep blue, had a determined set to them. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she had the look of someone who had weathered many storms before this one. "The baby's father," Robert found himself asking. "Is he not in the picture?" "It's just me," Hannah said quickly. Robert nodded. He knew better than to pry. Lord knows people have their reasons for the choices they make. "You should eat something," he said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "I've got stew on the table, nothing special, but it's hot." As they sat across from each other in the flickering candlelight, Robert tried not to stare. There was a quiet dignity about the way Hannah held herself, even in borrowed clothes, with her hair still damp from the rain. "Tell me about your aunt," Robert said, breaking the silence. "The one in Millerville." Something flashed across Hannah's face, uncertainty, maybe. "I've never actually met her. My mother told me about her before she died last year. Said I should look her up if I ever needed help." "And you need help now?" Robert observed. Hannah's hand went to her belly again. "More than ever." Another contraction rippled across her face. Longer this time. Robert checked his watch. 20 minutes since the last one. Too close together for comfort. "What's your aunt's name?" he asked, trying to distract her. "Millerville's not big. I might know her." "Margaret," Hannah said, her breathing evening out as the contraction passed. "Margaret Miller. At least that was her maiden name. I'm not sure if she married." The spoon Robert had been holding clattered to the table. "What did you say?" "Margaret Miller," Hannah repeated, looking confused. "Is something wrong?" Robert felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Margaret Miller was his wife. Hannah stared at him, her blue eyes widening. "You're Robert Miller?" He nodded slowly, his mind racing. Margaret never had any siblings. She was an only child. "No," Hannah said, leaning forward urgently. "She had a sister, my mother, Elizabeth Collins, born Elizabeth Miller." Robert shook his head firmly. "That's impossible. I knew my wife for 40 years. She would have told me if she had a sister." Hannah's hand went to her throat, and for the first time, Robert noticed the silver locket that hung there. It was tarnished with age, but the design was unmistakable, a heart-shaped pendant with a small flower etched into the surface. Robert felt the blood drain from his face. He knew that locket. He had given an identical one to Margaret on their 20th anniversary. She had worn it every day until— "Where did you get that?" he demanded, his voice barely a whisper. Hannah looked down, her fingers closing around the locket. "It was my mother's. She gave it to me before she died." With trembling fingers, she opened the tiny clasp. Inside was a faded photograph, yellowed with age. Two young women, arms around each other, laughing at the camera. One was unmistakably a younger version of Margaret. The other— "My mother," Hannah said simply. Robert couldn't speak. It was like seeing a ghost, not just of his wife, but of a life he never knew she had. "She never told you about her sister, did she?" Hannah asked softly. Before Robert could answer, a flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The storm was directly overhead now, and as if on cue, Hannah gasped, both hands clutching her belly. "That one was stronger," she said, her voice tight with pain. Robert might not have known what to make of this woman's claims about being Margaret's niece, but he knew that look of pain. He'd seen it twice before, when his own children were born. "How far apart are they now?" he asked, pushing aside his confusion to focus on the more immediate concern. "Getting closer," Hannah admitted. "Maybe 15 minutes. Robert ran a hand over his face. The storm wasn't letting up. The phones were out, and the nearest hospital was 30 miles away. Even if her car hadn't broken down, there was no way they'd make it in time. "I helped birth our children," he said finally. "And more calves and foals than I can count. If it comes to that—" Hannah nodded, a flash of fear crossing her face before she mastered it. "I trust you." Those simple words hit Robert like a physical blow. How could she trust him? She barely knew him. And yet, if she was who she claimed to be, Margaret's niece, then she was family, his family in a way. "Try to rest between contractions," he advised. "I'll gather some supplies just in case." As Robert moved through the darkened house, collecting clean towels, scissors, and string, his mind whirled with questions. If Margaret had a sister, why had she never mentioned her? What could have happened between them that was so terrible she would erase her own sister from her life? And perhaps most importantly, what was Hannah really doing here? Was it truly just coincidence that her car had broken down near his farm? Or had she been looking for him all along? By the time he returned to the living room, Hannah was pacing slowly in front of the fire, one hand pressed against her lower back. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment, the firelight caught her profile in a way that made his heart stop. The resemblance to Margaret was undeniable. "Your contractions," he said, setting down his gathered supplies. "How often now?" "About 12 minutes, she replied, wincing slightly. "But I think my water just broke." Robert nodded grimly. "There will be no hospital tonight. This baby is coming here, in this house that has seen generations of Millers born and raised." "Tell me about my aunt," Hannah said suddenly, as if sensing his thoughts. "What was she like?" Robert settled into his armchair, watching as Hannah continued her slow pacing. Margaret was steady, the kind of woman who could weather any storm and still have a smile for you at the end of it. He felt his throat tighten. She loved this farm, loved our children, never complained about the hard years, and there were plenty. My mother was different, Hannah said softly. Always restless, always searching for something just out of reach. Another contraction hit, and Hannah gripped the back of the couch, her knuckles white. Robert checked his watch. 10 minutes now. What happened between them? He asked when she could speak again. Why didn't Margaret ever talk about her sister? Hannah shook her head. My mother wouldn't say exactly. Just that there was a fight when they were young and they both said things they couldn't take back. She met his eyes. She regretted it at the end. Made me promise to find her sister to make things right. Margaret passed away 3 years ago, Robert said gently. Heart attack. It was quick, at least. Hannah's face crumpled. I'm too late. Maybe not entirely, Robert found himself saying. She left behind 2 children, though they're grown and moved away now, and grandchildren who'd be your cousins, I suppose. Thunder rolled again, closer this time, and the windows rattled in their frames. The storm showed no signs of letting up. But inside, something had shifted. The tension in the room had been replaced by a strange sort of understanding. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation and pain. Robert moved the furniture, laid down clean sheets, and built up the fire. Hannah's contractions grew steadily closer, then began to blend together. Through it all, they talked about Margaret, about Elizabeth, about the family that neither of them had known they shared. I was going to name the baby Margaret if it's a girl, Hannah confessed during a brief respite. After the aunt I never met. Robert felt something crack open inside him, a space he'd thought permanently sealed with grief. She would have liked that. As midnight approached, the storm reached its peak. Rain lashed against the windows with renewed fury, and the wind seemed determined to tear the roof from the rafters. But inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. It's time, Hannah gasped, her face contorted with effort. The baby's coming now. Robert had delivered foals and calves and had been by Margaret's side for the birth of their 2 children. But that had been over 30 years ago. And he'd had Margaret's steady presence to guide him. Now it was just him, a woman he'd only met hours ago, and the ghost of his wife hovering over them both. You can do this, he told Hannah, trying to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. Just listen to your body and push when it tells you to. Hannah nodded, too focused on her breathing to speak. Her hands gripped the sheets beneath her with white-knuckled intensity. What happened next seemed both endless and instantaneous. Hannah's cries mingled with the howling wind as she fought to bring her child into the world. Robert moved as if in a dream, his farmer's hands suddenly remembering skills he hadn't used in decades. And then, between one clap of thunder and the next, a new sound filled the room, the indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. It's a girl, Robert said, his voice thick with emotion as he carefully cleaned the tiny, red-faced infant. A beautiful baby girl. When he placed the child in Hannah's arms, he saw on her face the same look of wonder and love he'd seen on Margaret's face all those years ago. Some things, it seemed, ran in the family. Margaret, Hannah whispered, stroking the baby's cheek with one finger. Little Margaret. As if in response, the storm outside began to subside, the wind dropping from a howl to a sigh. By the time Robert had cleaned up and moved Hannah to the bedroom to rest, rain was falling in a gentle patter against the roof. Exhausted but too wired to sleep, Robert settled into the rocking chair beside the bed, watching as Hannah dozed with little Margaret nestled against her chest. In the soft glow of the battery-powered lantern, he could see Margaret's features reflected in Hannah's face, the same determined set of the jaw, the same slight curve at the corner of the mouth. How had he not seen it immediately? The family resemblance was unmistakable now that he knew to look for it. As dawn broke, Robert stepped onto the porch to survey the storm's damage. The old oak at the edge of the property had lost a few branches, and there were puddles large enough to be called ponds dotting the driveway. But the house had stood firm, as it had through countless storms before. When he returned inside, he found Hannah awake, feeding the baby with a look of tired contentment. "The phone should be working again soon," he said, settling back into the rocking chair. "We should get you both to a doctor. Make sure everything's all right." Hannah nodded, then hesitated. "Robert, there's something else I need to tell you." He waited, a knot forming in his stomach. More secrets, more revelations. "I didn't just come looking for Margaret," Hannah admitted. "I came looking for you too." "Me?" Robert frowned. "How did you even know about me?" Hannah's fingers went to the locket again. "My mother kept track of her sister from a distance. She knew about you, about your children. She was too proud to reach out. But she never stopped caring. And you? Why come looking now after all this time?" Hannah looked down at the baby in her arms, then back up at Robert. "Because I have nothing and no one else. My mother's gone. The baby's father left when he found out I was pregnant. I have no job, no home." Her voice caught. "The locket was the only valuable thing my mother left me, and I couldn't bring myself to sell it." Robert felt a familiar ache in his chest, the same one he'd felt when Margaret died, when his children moved away, when the farmhouse grew too quiet, the ache of emptiness, of spaces that should be filled with family. "You have me now," he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "If you want." Hannah's eyes filled with tears. "You barely know me." "I knew Margaret," Robert said simply. "And I see her in you. That's enough for me to know you've got a place here, if you need it. Both of you." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, sending shafts of golden light through the windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean. And inside, where the quiet had been almost unbearable for 3 long years, the soft sounds of a newborn's breathing filled the air, a new generation of millers under the old farmhouse roof. 6 months later, Robert stood on that same porch, watching as Hannah hung laundry on the line while little Margaret played on a blanket in the shade. The baby had grown like a weed, with Margaret's blue eyes and Hannah's dark hair. They'd settled into a routine, he and Hannah. She handled the cooking and most of the housework, while he taught her about the farm, which he'd started working again with a vigor that surprised even him. In the evenings, they'd sit together on the porch, sharing stories about the 2 sisters who had taken such different paths. Robert had reached out to his own children, explaining the strange twist of fate that had brought their cousin into their lives. They'd been skeptical at first, but one look at the locket and at little Margaret's familiar eyes had convinced them. Last month, they'd all gathered at the farm for a reunion of sorts. For the first time in years, the old house had rung with laughter and the patter of children's feet. As Robert watched Hannah hang the last of the sheets, he thought about the storm that had brought her to his door. Sometimes the most destructive forces of nature could also clear the way for new beginnings. Hannah turned and caught him watching, offering a smile that was becoming more confident each day. She was finding her footing here, growing roots in the same soil that had nourished generations of millers. "Penny for your thoughts," she called. Robert shook his head, smiling back. "Just thinking that Margaret would have liked this. Seeing the family together again." Hannah's hand went to the locket she still wore every day. "I think she does see it," she said softly, "and I think she's happy."